The family was walking along an empty shoreline. Peppa and George were collecting shells. The white beam of the lighthouse slid across the shore. It suddenly turned bright red. The beam fell onto the sand a meter away from George. The spot of sand under the beam instantly blackened. A vortex formed. The sand hissed as it was drawn downward. Tentacles burst out of the vortex. They resembled crystals, but were flexible and sticky. The tentacles reached toward George. One wrapped around his ankle. George screamed. He tried to pull his leg away. The lighthouse began to blink chaotically. The beam holding George grew brighter. George stopped resisting. His eyes became glazed over. He walked toward the vortex with mechanical steps. Dad and Mom rushed toward George. Their movements suddenly slowed down. The skin on their faces started to lose color, turning gray. Peppa ran after them, shouting. The red lighthouse beam found Dad and Mom. It trembled over them. The vortex expanded. Black tentacles stretched toward new victims. Peppa overtook her parents, rushing toward the lighthouse staircase. She had to stop the light. The red beam slid after her, striking the nearby cliff. Peppa burst into the round room at the top. A giant lens of the lighthouse occupied one wall. In the center stood a control panel with an old handle. In the corner, blending with shadows, sat the keeper. His face was hidden beneath a hood. The keeper muttered softly. His voice was hoarse like the sound of surf in a shell. Peppa ran up to the control panel. Suddenly, the keeper lifted his head sharply. Shadows in the room thickened around him. Don't turn off the light. Peppa pulled on the handle with all her might. The keeper lunged at her. Shadows behind him stretched out like tentacles. The blood-red lighthouse beam went out. Darkness reigned for a moment. Then the beam flared back to life, blindingly black. Not light, but absence of light ripping through the night from the lens. Peppa ran out onto a narrow balcony surrounding the room. The black beam struck down at the shore below. She looked down. On the beach, in the center of the black beam, stood Dad, Mom, and George, their figures faintly glowing with a dull gray light. A huge black vortex pulsed on the sand beneath them. Black tentacles burst from the vortex. They wrapped around Dad's, Mom's, and George's legs, pulling downward. Suddenly, the lighthouse's red beam jerked sharply, aiming directly at Peppa on the balcony above her. Shadows on the balcony thickened. They stretched out from corners toward Peppa. Peppa and Pedro were standing by the shelves with children's books. Peppa noticed an old fairy tale book. Its cover shimmered with uneven light. The surface was cold and sticky. The book opened itself. The pages stuck together and became damp. Black letters slid off the pages in a viscous mass. The mass formed insects with thin, shiny legs. The insects crawled onto Peppa's hands. Peppa screamed. She threw the book to the floor. Nearby books began to open one after another. Swarms of black creatures flew out of the books. Pedro was standing by a small bookhouse watching an open book. Letters from its pages detached and crawled onto his hands. A black mass enveloped Pedro's face. He froze in place. A sharp squeal tore through the air, sounding like tearing parchment. The librarian stood at the end of the aisle, her eyes shining unnaturally. Peppa burst into an empty hall. She dove under the nearest table. The librarian's white shoes stopped nearby. Her socks looked directly at her. Peppa froze. The shoes turned away and moved back. Peppa crawled out from under the table. The librarian was standing by a window. Peppa started crawling toward the archive door. She turned around. The librarian turned her head. Her eyes became spinning reels. Distorted letters flickered on film strips within them. Her mouth stretched into a silent scream. Peppa was pulled into the darkness of the storage room. Shelves rose up to the ceiling, towering over her. The air was thick with dust. She pressed against the door, her heart pounding fiercely. At the end of the aisle stood a figure, motionless. Peppa approached. Pedro was facing a shelf, his face covered with black mass that pulsed slowly. Books on the shelves trembled. Pages fluttered wildly. A mask on Pedro's face turned around. Empty eye sockets stared at Peppa directly. She ran toward the exit. The daylight beckoned at the end. She hurried around a corner. Peppa froze. Standing in front of it was the librarian, blocking her way. Her figure was motionless. Her reel-like eyes spun slowly, flickering Peppa's name on film. Her mouth stretched into that same voiceless grimace. Black shadows oozed from beneath her skirt, flowing onto the floor like ink. Peppa turned back. Behind her, shadows caught up, wrapping around her legs as cold, sticky mass rose upward. The light from behind the door faded the motionless figure of the librarian, and advancing darkness obscured it completely. Peppa put on an old record. The cheerful melody suddenly crackled and slowed down. Old songs remember more than words. Shadows stretched toward Peppa. On the TV, the silhouette of Mr. Melodious. A whisper from the speaker.
Peppa, George, onto the stage.
Black tar flows from the speaker. A thud from above. Child's room. The squeak of toys. A tentacle of tar burst out of the speaker. Peppa jumped back. The shadow of the turntable grew up to the ceiling in the shape of Melodious. The conductor calls the orchestra. Peppa ran upstairs. Tar was chasing her. The stairs rippled like water. Shadows of the railing. Tentacles. On the landing, Peppa looked back. Below stood Melodious. A flick of his spike. Drops of tar dripped from above. On the steps, distorted notes. Peppa burst into the nursery, slammed the door shut. Suddenly, a knock sounded. A refuge or a stage. George froze. Boys jerked in sync. Wallpaper, pulsating notes. The ceiling, hanging tentacles. George turned around. Black eyes. A mechanical smile. From his mouth, a distorted hum. Boys marched toward Peppa. The teddy bear clicked its jaws. Everyone in formation. The door opened. A ghostly mom. Her face blurred. Her mouth a howling melody. The conductor is pleased with new voices. Peppa rushed toward the door. Mom grabbed her with tentacle-like hands. George stood up and pulled Peppa inside as toys surrounded them. Tar sealed the window, the staircase, nursery walls, sheet music stands. The ceiling presses down. The conductor found his soloists. Tar bound Peppa tight. Melodious bowed deeply. Hollow eye sockets, crimson light. Melodious waved his spine. Mom and George opened their mouths, and a deafening howl erupted. Peppa twitched in rhythm. Tar covered her eyes. An endless game began. Peppa and George were building a castle in the sandbox. The sand beneath their feet trembled. Suddenly, holes appeared in the ground. Dark, sticky pits. A black tentacle grabbed George's dinosaur. The holes vanished instantly. The sand felt cold, heavy. Round mounds started to rise all around. One of them opened, revealing a black, sandy mouth full of teeth. Peppa grabbed George and they ran toward the house. The mouth growled behind them. Waves of sand rippled under their feet. Evening. The backyard. Shadows were growing longer. From a new hole, George's dinosaur crawled out, covered in shiny black sand, its red eyes glowing. The toy turned its head and looked at Peppa. The dinosaur's teeth had turned black. All the sandy patches in the yard began to stir. Tentacles of black sand stretched out toward the children. The entire yard became a sea of moving black sand. A giant faceless figure emerged. In its mouth, absolute darkness. Peppa and George ran into the house. On the walls, a flickering reflection appeared. Behind Peppa stood 1,000 barely visible sandy hands. Peppa slammed the door shut. George was crying. Black sand tapped against the glass and crept up the walls of the house. Soon it began slipping under the door. Grains of sand fell from the ceiling onto Peppa's shoulder. She ran to the kitchen. The hourglass on the table flipped over, and the sand inside turned black. In the window's reflection, Peppa saw her own face, but her eyes were filled with black sand. The walls began to form a shifting message, written in sand. "You will not leave." Peppa returned to the hallway. A shadow flickered. George was standing there, but without a face and with eyes made of black grains. In the corner of the room, the sand gathered into a tall arch, through which distant laughter could be heard, though no one was laughing.